December 1941. The airfields near Engels, Russia. The ground is frozen to stone, and the night sky hangs low like a slab of steel. The wind cuts through uniforms, and even the engines seem to groan under the cold. The Soviet Union is burning. From Smolensk to Rostov, the Wehrmacht's advance is tearing through towns that had existed for centuries. Moscow is nearly surrounded. Every day brings new telegrams with numbers that no longer make sense. Numbers of the dead, the captured, the lost. Inside a dimly lit command room at the Soviet Air Force headquarters, maps cover the walls like scars. Red lines show what's left of the front. And somewhere between those lines, an idea is born. An idea so desperate, so absurd to some, that even hardened officers raise their eyebrows when they hear it. A women's Night Bomber Regiment. The signature at the bottom of the document is unmistakable. Joseph Stalin. The directive is issued under the People's Commissariat of Defense, Order No. 0099, October 8, 1941. The order calls for the creation of 3 new all-female aviation regiments. On paper, it looks like propaganda, a morale boost for a crumbling nation. In reality, it is a calculated act of necessity. The country has run out of trained male pilots. Many are dead or missing. But there's something the Germans underestimated, something hidden deep inside the Soviet system, women who had been flying long before the war even began. One of them was Marina Raskova, a record-breaking aviator known as the Russian Amelia Earhart. Before the war, she had set multiple distance and endurance records, crossing the Siberian tundra and the Caspian skies. Her fame made her a national hero. Her name alone could open doors at the Kremlin. When the war began, she flooded the Ministry of Defense with telegrams, demanding that women be allowed to serve as combat pilots. At first, her requests were ignored. But by late 1941, with the Wehrmacht closing in, Stalin himself changed his mind. He summoned her to Moscow. Raskova, in her fur-lined flight jacket and a look of calm defiance, entered the dim office where high-ranking officers debated the future of the Soviet Air Force. The smell of tobacco and kerosene filled the room. "Comrade Raskova," said one general, "we need every plane we can get. But women in combat, flying at night, you understand what you're asking for." She looked at him directly. "I understand," she said. "And I'm telling you, they're ready." Within weeks, telegrams were sent across the Soviet Union. Female pilots, navigators, and mechanics with flight experience report to Engels Air Base. The call reached schools, factories, and small air clubs scattered from Minsk to Vladivostok. More than 2,000 women applied. Only 400 were accepted. They came by train, in old coats and threadbare boots, carrying small suitcases and big dreams. Most were in their early 20s. Some were barely 18. A few had already lost brothers or fathers on the front lines. When they arrived at Engels, they found a base covered in snow, a handful of worn-out training planes, and officers who didn't believe in them. "Ladies," one mechanic reportedly said, "the only thing you'll bomb is our patience." But they didn't argue. They saluted and got to work. Among the recruits was Yevdokiya Bershanskaya, who would become their commanding officer, calm, precise, and utterly fearless. Another was Nadezhda Popova, a fiery pilot whose laughter could echo across the airfield even in the darkest night. And there was Yevgenia Rudneva, a young astronomer from Moscow University, who volunteered as a navigator. She used to chart stars. Now she would use them to guide planes through darkness. The aircraft they were given were Polykarpov Po-2 biplanes, slow, wooden training planes built before the war. They had no armor, no radio, and no parachutes. Their maximum speed was so low that even German fighters could stall trying to chase them. Each Po-2 could carry 2 bombs, one under each wing. To reach the target, they had to fly low, cut their engines, and glide silently through the night. The Germans called them Nachthexen, night witches, because their approach sounded like the whoosh of a broomstick through the sky. But in 1941, None of the young pilots knew that nickname yet. All they knew was that they were expected to do the impossible. It was June 8th, 1942, when the 588th Night Bomber Regiment flew its first combat mission. The briefing was simple: bomb a German fuel depot near the Don River. Distance, 80 kilometers. Weather, freezing rain. Visibility, nearly zero. Each crew carried 2 bombs, a compass, and a map that was already smudged with oil. Their cockpits were open to the wind. The pilots wrapped their faces in scarves and stuffed rags in their boots to keep warm. Bershanskaya gave a final order. Remember, silence is your weapon. Glide in. Drop. Disappear. And they did. The Po-2s took off one by one, their engines sputtering in the cold. From the ground, they looked like slow-moving shadows. But in the night sky, they became something else entirely, a whisper of defiance. A quiet message that said Russia still breathes. When they reached the target, they cut their engines and descended. The sound that followed was unforgettable. The soft whistle of the wind over wooden wings. And then, a thunderous explosion in the dark. The first German camp to feel their attack thought it was sabotage, not aircraft. The next night, it happened again. And again. By the end of the week, the 588th had completed 42 missions. Every bomb hit its mark. But the price was high. Each night meant hours in sub-zero temperatures, with frost freezing their eyelids shut. Sometimes the engines wouldn't start, and they would have to crank them by hand. Sometimes anti-aircraft shells exploded so close that fabric peeled off the wings. And sometimes the plane simply didn't return. The regiment began to paint small stars under their cockpits, one for every successful mission. By the end of 1942, some planes had more than 50. In her diary, navigator Yevdokiya wrote, "When you fly through darkness, you stop feeling fear. You only feel the sky. The stars become your friends. The sound of your engine, your heartbeat. The enemy below? Just shadows." Her handwriting was neat, almost peaceful. She would later be shot down over Crimea in 1944. By early 1943, even the German intelligence reports began to take notice. "Beware the female night bombers," one field memo read. "They attack silently. They are hard to hit. They never give up." Luftwaffe pilots grew frustrated. They mocked them at first, paper planes, flying sewing machines. But soon, those jokes stopped. Because every time the moon rose, somewhere in the east, the night witches came again. They destroyed ammunition depots, rail lines, fuel trains. They flew over Stalingrad, Kuban, and Crimea, missions that male squadrons refused to attempt. Each sortie took place in total darkness, at altitudes so low that their own bombs sometimes rocked their planes. And yet, they never missed. The 588th Regiment was more than a military experiment. It was a statement, a declaration that even in the darkest time in modern history, courage could come in unexpected forms. They flew 30,000 missions by the end of the war, dropped over 23,000 tons of bombs, and earned 23 Heroes of the Soviet Union, the highest military distinction. But back in 1942, at that frozen base in Engels, none of that existed yet. Only the sound of the wind, the hum of an old engine, and the quiet laughter of young women who had no idea they were becoming legends. They didn't ask for glory. They didn't ask for fame. They asked for planes and a chance to fight. And Stalin gave them that chance. The wind over the steppe was merciless. It carried the scent of engine oil, sweat, and fear. It was early spring of 1942, and the Red Army was being pushed back once again. The front lines were chaotic, collapsing and reforming like waves against an unforgiving shore. But somewhere beyond the Volga, in the dusty airfield near Engels, something entirely new was taking shape. They were young, so young that some still braided their hair with ribbons. Others carried the quiet steadiness of women who had already seen too much. And all of them had gathered under a single, extraordinary banner, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, soon to be known by the Germans as Nachthexen, the Night Witches. The order had come directly from Marshal Clement Voroshilov, approved by Joseph Stalin himself, but its heart belonged to one woman, Marina Raskova. Known across the Soviet Union as the Soviet Amelia Earhart, Raskova had set multiple aviation records before the war, long-distance flights, daring endurance runs, and navigation challenges that had made her a national hero. When the German invasion began in June 1941, she had written directly to Stalin. Her letter was firm, clear, and charged with conviction. "Our women can do more than nurse the wounded. We can fly. We can fight. Give us the sky." Within weeks, the state had approved the creation of 3 all-female aviation regiments, and among them, the 588th. The mission: night harassment bombing of German positions, supply lines, and encampments. The planes assigned to them: the Polikarpov Po-2, a fragile, wood and canvas biplane first built as a crop duster, slow, outdated, completely unarmed except for a single machine gun, and capable of carrying just 2 50-kilogram bombs. It was laughable, it was impossible, and yet it was perfect. The airfield at Engels buzzed with chaos. The sound of saws and hammering filled the air as mechanics worked to keep the old Po-2s alive. The women trained from dawn until the stars rose: navigation, mechanics, formation flying, emergency landings. "Sleep is a luxury," said Yevdokiya Bershanskaya, the regiment's commander. A quiet, strict, and endlessly determined woman. "Our enemy doesn't sleep. Neither will we." Under her command, the women learned to operate like shadows. They learned how to cut the engines in midair to glide silently toward a target. They learned how to drop their bombs by hand, and they learned how to fly so low that the earth seemed to reach up and grab them. One cadet, Irina Shabrova, wrote in her diary, "The Po-2 feels alive. It shakes, it hums, it talks to you. We fly at treetop level, and the darkness hides everything except the faint glow of the instruments. We do not fear the dark. The dark is our ally." They were issued men's uniforms, oversized boots stuffed with newspaper, jackets that hung loose around their shoulders. Their hair was cropped short, their faces smudged with oil. But when the training was over and the call came to move to the front, they didn't hesitate. Their first operational base lay near Stavropol, in the southern front. The night was cold, the wind heavy with dust. The Germans were advancing through the Caucasus, and the Soviet command needed every distraction possible. The 588th's first sortie was unremarkable by military standards, a small ammunition dump lightly guarded. But for the women inside those fragile biplanes, it was a leap into the abyss. Engines on, came the call. The propellers roared to life. A low, trembling hum that faded as each plane lifted into the dark. They flew in pairs, pilot and navigator, without radio, relying only on moonlight, compass, and intuition. Above the front line, flak bursts dotted the night like deadly stars. The women cut their engines, gliding silently toward the target. And then, the soft, hollow thud of bombs falling. Moments later, the horizon bloomed with fire. The Germans panicked, firing wildly into the sky. But the Po-2s were ghosts, invisible, inaudible, until it was too late. When the women returned, exhausted and exhilarated, Bershanskaya met them with a rare smile. "Congratulations," she said. "You've earned your wings." By mid-1942, the Germans had given the regiment its nickname, Nachthexen, Night Witches. The sound of their engines, that soft wooden whirring, reminded German soldiers of a witch's broomstick. They claimed the Soviet women flew with supernatural precision, appearing from nowhere, vanishing without a trace. One German POW, WW2, the Russian women pilots came like death in the Withams, were already falling. The nickname was meant as an insult. The women wore it as a badge of honor. War spares no one. In October 1942, during a mission over the Kuban region, the During a mission over, the navigator named Nadezhda Popova was shot down. Her plane crashed behind enemy lines. She survived, bruised, bleeding, half conscious, and made her way back on foot through the forest. When she finally returned to base, covered in mud and blood, Bershanskaya simply nodded. "Wash up," she said. "You're flying again tonight." Popova would later recall, "We were not afraid of dying. We were afraid of not being useful." Every night they flew 6 to 8 sorties, sometimes up to 12. They patched their planes with canvas and tape, flew with frozen hands, and landed on airstrips lit only by flashlights. By the end of 1942, they had completed over 20,000 missions, dropping more than 3,000 tons of bombs. Winter came. The steppe turned white, silent, merciless. Fuel froze. Engines stalled. Bombs stuck in their racks. Yet the night witches continued to fly. One night, over the frozen Don River, Yevgenia Jigalenko recorded in her flight log, "Visibility 0, wind, cruel. But the target burns, and that is enough." By dawn, the base was a graveyard of frostbitten fingers, cracked lips, and hollow eyes. And still, the laughter. The unshakable humor that kept them human. They sang as they repaired planes. They wrote to their mothers. They buried their friends and went back to the sky. By early 1943, the 588th Regiment had become legend. Every soldier on the Eastern Front knew their name or their whispers. When they flew, the night trembled. When they landed, the earth seemed smaller, emptier. And somewhere between the rumble of distant guns and the whisper of the steppe wind, a new myth had been born, not of witches, but of women who refused to yield. As one letter, found years later in the archives of Engels Airfield, said, "We did not fly to become heroes. We flew so that one day others would not have to." The autumn air over Stalingrad burned. It was not the kind of fire born from warmth or comfort. It was the dry, crackling fire of war itself. Columns of smoke climbed like black veins into the starless sky, and far below, the Volga River reflected only red and orange, flames, tracer rounds, the ghosts of factories now reduced to rubble. In that darkness, the sound of engines could barely be heard, quiet, almost fragile, like the beating wings of birds. They came from the east, from across the river, from a place the Germans nicknamed Die Nachthexen, the Night Witches. Each plane, the slow, creaking Polykarpov Po-2, looked like a relic from another era. Made of wood and canvas, it should not have survived a single German bullet. Yet here they were, dozens of them, moving silently through the void, cutting through the heat waves that rose from the city below. "Cut the engines," whispered Captain Yevdokiya Bershanskaya, the commanding officer of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. Her voice carried through the wind like an order and a prayer in one breath. The women obeyed. The hum of the engines died. The world fell silent except for the whistling rush of air against the fabric wings. They glided, invisible. From the ground, German soldiers would later swear they heard broomsticks swishing through the night sky. Some claimed they could sense the witches before they even appeared. A whisper, a rustle, and then the explosion. That's where the nickname came from, Die Nachthexen. Stalingrad was more than a battlefield. It was an open wound. Streets were reduced to ash, fountains to craters. The few surviving civilians huddled in cellars, praying through the sound of falling bombs. The city's heartbeat was irregular, weak, yet defiant. The Night Witches knew that heartbeat well. Every mission they flew across the Volga felt like a conversation with the dying city. Each bomb they dropped was both revenge and mercy. Revenge against those who had turned homes into rubble, and mercy for the soldiers pinned under impossible fire. At this stage of the war, the 588th had already flown over 20,000 sorties. Most of them had less than 10 minutes between takeoff and landing. The missions were suicidal, no armor, no parachutes, no radios. Only maps drawn by hand and the moonlight as their compass. "We learned to see in the dark," one of the pilots, Irina Rakobolskaya, later recalled in her memoirs. We could tell the direction of the wind from the way it smelled. If it carried oil and smoke, we were near Stalingrad. Captain Bershanskaya was not a woman of speeches. Her face carried the fatigue of every flight, every funeral, every letter sent home with no return address. She led the regiment not by shouting, but by simply showing up every night. The women worshipped her, not out of fear, but out of a kind of sacred respect. She knew their names, their families, their superstitions. When one of the girls tied a ribbon to her wrist before every mission, a promise to come back alive, Bershanskaya never told her to remove it. She knew belief was sometimes the only armor they had. That night, October 12th, 1942, was colder than usual. The wind was strong, coming from the northwest, dangerous for gliding. Yet orders had arrived from the 16th Air Army Command, bomb German supply lines north of the city. The target was heavily defended, a railway bridge connecting the 6th Army's rear positions. The Germans had installed searchlights, Flak 37 cannons, and radar-assisted tracking. Even male Soviet pilots considered it nearly impossible. Bershanskaya didn't flinch. She gathered her crews, laid the maps across a metal crate, and said only one thing: "We will do what the men cannot." The first plane to take off was piloted by Nadezhda Popova, with Yevdokiya Nozel as her navigator. Both were veterans, already decorated for previous missions. Their Po-2 lifted into the night like a fragile leaf, trembling under the wind. The second followed, and the third. Soon, the whole squadron, 9 planes in total, was airborne. Each carried 2 50-kilogram bombs strapped under the wings. To save weight, they left behind anything unnecessary: parachutes, armor plates, even radio equipment. Every kilogram mattered. Our planes were so light, Popova once said, that even the searchlights had trouble locking onto us. We would cut the engines and glide, and they could never hear where we'd come from. The mission was simple on paper, suicidal in execution: cross the river, evade radar, bomb the railway, and return. But the wind that night turned against them, scattering their formation over the Volga. One plane went down before reaching the target, a direct hit from an anti-air shell. Another disappeared entirely, swallowed by the dark water below. Still, the others continued. By 2 a.m., the surviving planes neared the German line. The anti-air batteries had gone quiet, fooled by the sudden silence. The pilots had already cut their engines, gliding through the night like shadows. The first bombs dropped, then the second. A heartbeat later, explosions. The railway bridge lit up in orange fire. The Germans scrambled, firing blindly into the sky. The night witches turned, engines sputtering back to life, and vanished into the east. When dawn came, Soviet reconnaissance confirmed it. The railway bridge had been destroyed. It would take the Germans 2 full days to rebuild, halting their supply to the front. That delay, though small, saved hundreds of Soviet lives. It also marked one of the turning points in the defense of Stalingrad. And yet, none of the women received public credit. In official dispatches, the success was attributed simply to night bomber units. Their names were omitted, their courage buried under anonymity. "We didn't need glory," said Popova years later. "We only wanted to see the morning again." There's an airfield in Krasnodar, once nothing more than an expanse of dust and frost, where grass now grows between the cracks of forgotten runways. It's quiet there, only the sound of the wind brushing against birch trees. Yet, for those who know, it is sacred ground. This was where the 46th Taman Guards Night Bomber Regiment was born, where young women once walked in leather boots far too large for them, where laughter mixed with the smell of oil and gunpowder. Here, they waited for orders, for dawn, for the war to end. And when it finally did, in 1945, many of them returned to the same field, not to fly, but to remember. There's a story that Nadezhda Popova came back here once, in 1962. She was already an instructor then, teaching a new generation of pilots who had only read about the war in books. She stood beside an old Po-2, her hands on its wooden frame, and whispered, "You are our wings. You are our home." The plane did not answer, but the wind did, softly, like the murmur of propellers waking in the distance. When the war ended, most of the night witches were discharged. Their regiment was dissolved, their achievements recorded but seldom celebrated. They were told to go home, to marry, to forget. History had no room for women with medals, Popova later said in an interview. They preferred us to knit, not to fly. Some became teachers, engineers, doctors. Some never flew again. And some, like Yevdokiya Jigulenko, tried to keep the memory alive through films and documentaries, preserving the truth before it could be rewritten. Yet, for decades, their stories were confined to veterans' clubs and yellowing letters. Even their medals gathered dust until the next generation began to ask questions. Who were these women who flew without fear? Why had no one told us? It was only then that silence began to crack. History, of course, moved on. Wars ended. New machines replaced the old ones. But the sky, the same sky they once conquered, never forgot. And maybe that's the point. We forget names. We forget dates. But the courage remains woven into the air we breathe, waiting for someone new to take flight. So tonight, when the stars hang over your window and the wind hums softly outside, remember, somewhere above the clouds, in a sky that remembers everything, the night witches are still flying. And the world, quieter now, but freer because of them, still listens to the sound of their wings.